Ethan Marshall, a rising star in the tech world and a fierce advocate for social justice, is on the cusp of delivering the most important speech of his career. But a humiliating incident at the airport ignites a movement far beyond anything he could have imagined. What starts as a routine security check spirals into an act of blatant discrimination, derailing Ethan's carefully planned future and sparking a nationwide outcry. As #ClearSkies Equal Rights gains momentum, Ethan is thrust into the national spotlight, confronting not only the systemic racism embedded in air travel but also the dark shadows of his past. His old high school rival, Jonathan Wells, now a powerful airline CEO, stands at the center of this controversy, ready to sabotage Ethan's fight for justice. As Ethan digs deeper, he uncovers a shocking secret tying their families together, one that turns this corporate battle into something deeply personal. Will Ethan's quest for justice expose the corruption that runs through the airline industry, or will the secrets of the past come back to bury him? In a gripping battle of resilience and redemption, Ethan must decide how far he's willing to go to reclaim both his family's legacy and the future of countless others who have been silenced. A Clear Skies, Hidden Shadows is a riveting tale of race, power, and personal vengeance that asks, when the truth finally comes to light, will justice prevail? The sun streamed through the tall windows of Miles Turner's sleek downtown condo. He stretched his arms, a confident smile playing on his lips as he checked his phone. The notification blinked. Flight to San Francisco, Tech Summit keynote, 2 p.m. Today was important. This keynote would propel his already successful career to the next level, solidifying his place as a leader in the tech industry and as a champion for diversity. Dressed sharply in a tailored navy suit, Miles made his way to the kitchen, where he poured himself a cup of coffee. His phone buzzed. It was Lisa Grant, his social media strategist and close ally. "Ready for the big day?" she asked, her voice bright over the speaker. "I've been waiting for this one, Lisa." "I'm locked in," Miles replied, sipping his coffee. "This keynote is everything. It's not just about tech. It's about showing the world how important inclusion is." Lisa chuckled. "That's why they're paying you the big bucks. Just don't forget to tweet before you head out. We need to make sure everyone's watching." "You've got it covered, don't you?" Miles asked with a grin. "Of course. Just give me a signal when you're ready. Let's get that trending." As he hung up, Miles glanced at a framed photo on the mantel, an old high school picture of him and a few classmates. One face stood out, Marcus Dean. It had been years since Miles had thought about his old rival. The memory still stung. Marcus had always tried to outshine him, but Miles had come out on top. The past was behind him now, or so he thought. Miles arrived at O'Hare International Airport with time to spare, gliding through the bustling crowds with the quiet confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. As he approached security, he placed his shoes, watch, and laptop in a plastic bin. The conveyor belt hummed as his belongings moved forward. "Step over here, sir," a TSA officer said, signaling Miles to step aside. Miles frowned, used to the extra scrutiny. His ID and boarding pass were checked, then double-checked. "Everything okay?" he asked, trying to keep his tone even. The officer barely glanced at him. Random screening. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. As the officer patted him down, Miles couldn't help but notice how effortlessly the passengers around him, mostly white, moved through security with barely a second glance. His fists clenched, but he kept his cool. He knew better than to make a scene. When the screening finally ended, Miles gathered his things and walked toward the boarding gates, pushing the incident to the back of his mind. He was used to it by now, though it never got easier. At the gate, Miles handed his first-class ticket and ID to the airline attendant, a young woman who looked up at him briefly before returning to her screen. She frowned, then checked his ID again. "Is there a problem?" Miles asked. "Just a moment, sir. Your documentation seems incomplete," she replied flatly, not bothering to meet his eyes. "Incomplete? That can't be right." Miles leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "I travel all the time. Everything should be in order." The woman glanced nervously at the growing line behind him. "Please step aside, sir." Confused, Miles did as asked. A few other passengers eyed him suspiciously as they passed through with ease. A security guard soon appeared, followed by a supervisor. Miles' frustration grew as they repeated the same routine, examining his ID, scrutinizing him like he was some sort of criminal. "This has to be a mistake," Miles said, trying to keep his voice calm, though it was taking everything in him not to lose his cool. "I've flown dozens of times, and I've never had an issue." The supervisor finally spoke, though his tone was curt. "We're running this through our system, but you'll need to wait." Miles watched helplessly as the minutes ticked by, the boarding process continuing without him. It was humiliating. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the supervisor handed back his documents with a grudging, "Looks like you're clear. Apologies for the inconvenience." But the damage was done. Miles' flight was already pulling away from the gate. Sitting in the airport's sterile waiting area, Miles stared blankly at the planes taxiing outside the window. He could still feel the stares, the whispers. His phone buzzed, and a message from his friend Jordan popped up. "How did it go?" Miles sighed deeply before typing back. "Didn't make it. Airport mess. Another racial profiling incident." Moments later, Jordan called. "Man, what happened?" Miles relayed the story, each word filling him with more frustration. "It was just blatant. I showed them my ID over and over, but they wouldn't let me board. Everyone else just walked through." "This can't keep happening to you, Miles. We need to get the word out," Jordan said, his voice firm. Miles hesitated. "I don't know, man. What's it going to change?" "A lot. You've got the platform now. People need to see what's going on. It's not just about you. It's bigger than that. Post about it. Use your voice." Lisa's words from earlier echoed in Miles' mind. After a long pause, he finally said, "Okay, let's do it." He pulled out his phone and began typing, his fingers flying across the screen. In a matter of minutes, the tweet was up. "Denied boarding today for no reason. Racial profiling is alive and well in air travel. Hashtag identity denied." Within an hour, the post had gone viral. Retweets, comments, and support flooded in as others shared their own stories of discrimination. The hashtag began to trend, and soon, media outlets started reaching out. Miles watched the screen, feeling a mix of vindication and unease. This was far from over. Meanwhile, in a sleek boardroom at Skyline Airlines headquarters, Marcus Dean sat in a meeting reviewing the latest PR reports. He barely paid attention until a name caught his eye. Miles Turner, his old high school rival. "Sir," his assistant said, "this incident with Turner is gaining traction online. It's becoming a PR nightmare. He's accusing us of racial profiling." Marcus smirked, memories of their high school rivalry surfacing. Miles had always outshined him back then, but now he had the upper hand. This was his turf. "Let me handle this," Marcus said, his tone dripping with disdain. "We'll issue a statement denying any wrongdoing. We can't let him think he has any power over us." As Marcus leaned back in his chair, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of satisfaction. Miles Turner was making noise, but he would make sure it didn't go any further. In a sleek boardroom high above the city, Marcus Dean sat across from the airline's top executives, a folder of PR updates in his hands. The room was tense. The CEO, Janet Marshall, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her expression unreadable as she scanned the reports. "Explain to me why this is happening," she demanded, tossing a tablet with the latest headlines onto the table. The article read, "Racial profiling at Skyline Airlines sparks outrage. Hashtag identity denied goes viral." Marcus cleared his throat, leaning forward. "We underestimated how far this would go. Miles Turner has a platform, and he's using it." Janet raised an eyebrow. "You told me this would blow over." "He's capitalizing on the incident," Marcus replied, his voice measured. "But there was an edge to it. We can downplay it. Issue a non-apology. Something like, 'We regret the inconvenience and are reviewing our procedures.' People will forget in a week." Janet studied him for a long moment before speaking. "This isn't just some local news story, Marcus. This is national now. We're dealing with more than just one man's anger. We're dealing with a movement." Marcus felt a flicker of frustration. "We need to control the narrative. Let me handle this." "Make sure you do," Janet said coolly. "We can't afford to lose control." Marcus nodded, but inside, His thoughts churned. He would control it. Miles Turner wouldn't get the best of him again. Back in his office, Miles stared at his computer screen, watching the hashtag identity denied continue to trend. Thousands of people were sharing their stories, adding fuel to the fire he had started. But not all of the responses were supportive. His phone buzzed. Lisa's name popped up on the screen. "You seeing this?" she asked as soon as he picked up. "Yeah, I am," Miles said, scrolling through the comments. Among the support were accusations. Miles is just looking for attention, another overreaction, and maybe he's exaggerating to stay relevant. "People are saying I'm using this to boost my career," he muttered, frustration creeping into his voice. Lisa sighed. "You knew there'd be backlash. People hate when someone rocks the boat. The important thing is, you're doing something bigger than yourself. Don't let the negativity get to you." "I knew this would be hard," Miles admitted, "but it's different when it's personal. The media is twisting it. They're not seeing the bigger issue." "Then keep making them see it," Lisa said firmly. "You've got an audience now. Don't back down." Miles nodded, though a heavy weight settled in his chest. He had put his career on the line, and now there was no turning back. Later that evening, Miles sat in his sister Rachel's living room, the cozy warmth of her apartment contrasting with the storm swirling outside in the media. She poured them both coffee and sat across from him, her expression serious. "You okay?" she asked, pushing a mug toward him. "I'm fine," Miles said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just dealing with all this. I didn't think it would blow up like this." Rachel sipped her coffee, eyes thoughtful. "You've got a platform now, Miles. You've been fighting for diversity and inclusion in tech for years. This isn't much different, except now, the spotlight is on you. People are watching how you handle it." Miles leaned back, rubbing his temples. "And some of them think I'm making this about me." Rachel shook her head. "That's what they always say when you challenge the system. The important thing is that you keep pushing. You can't let this become just another social media flash in the pan." "I don't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I could lose everything over this." Rachel leaned forward, her gaze intense. "This isn't just about you. This is about the countless others who have faced what you faced at that airport. You're their voice now, whether you like it or not." Miles looked at her, absorbing her words. "So what do I do?" "You fight back," Rachel said, her tone steely. "And if you want, I'll help you. We can sue them." Racial discrimination cases are hard to win, but with the attention this has, you might actually have a chance. Miles stared into his coffee. A lawsuit. The idea was daunting, but it was also an opportunity to do something real. "I'll think about it." "You don't have long to think," Rachel said. "They're going to come after you harder now. Be ready." Meanwhile, at Skyline Airlines, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at a message from his team. The backlash was growing, and Miles was still trending. He had to act fast. His assistant knocked and entered the room. "Sir, we've drafted a response. A formal apology, as you suggested." "Scrap that," Marcus said, his jaw tight. "We're not apologizing." The assistant hesitated. "But sir, the board—" "I said scrap it," Marcus snapped. "We issue a statement about how we're committed to diversity and inclusion. We frame this as a misunderstanding. A one-time incident that doesn't reflect our company's values." "And what about Miles Turner?" the assistant asked, nervously shifting. Marcus' eyes narrowed. "We undermine him. Let's dig into his past. Find something we can use. We'll paint him as someone who's just looking for attention." The assistant nodded and quickly left the room, leaving Marcus alone with his thoughts. He knew exactly how to deal with people like Miles, people who thought they could challenge the system and win. This was personal. Miles had always been the golden boy, even back in high school. But not this time. Marcus had the power now. The following evening, Miles found himself in a sleek, brightly lit TV studio, preparing for a live interview. The debate was supposed to address the growing controversy around racial profiling in the airline industry, but Miles knew the real target was him. As the cameras rolled, the host smiled and began the segment. "Tonight, we're talking with entrepreneur and social justice advocate Miles Turner, whose recent viral post sparked the hashtag identity denied movement." Miles nodded, keeping his expression calm. He knew the tone was about to shift. The host continued, "Some people are calling you a hero, while others are saying you're using this incident to gain attention. What do you say to those critics?" Miles took a breath. "This isn't about me. It's about a pattern of discrimination that people of color face every day, especially in public spaces like airports. This is bigger than one incident." "But don't you think this could have been handled privately?" the host asked, leaning forward. "Couldn't this have been resolved without turning it into a national conversation?" Miles looked directly into the camera, his voice firm. "We've been handling things privately for too long. How many times does someone have to experience discrimination before they're allowed to speak up? This is about systemic issues. If we don't talk about it publicly, nothing changes." The host paused, clearly surprised by his response. "But the airline has stated that they're reviewing their procedures. Isn't that enough?" "No, it's not," Miles said, his frustration bubbling up. "A review is lip service unless it leads to real change. We need policies that prevent this from happening, not just statements that say they're committed to diversity." The segment ended shortly after, but Miles left the studio feeling both drained and emboldened. He had made his stance clear, but the road ahead was only going to get harder. Miles Turner paced his office, the weight of the situation heavy on his shoulders. The hashtag identity denied had gained traction faster than he'd imagined, but now it felt like it was spiraling out of control. Lisa Grant sat at her desk across the room, typing furiously on her laptop. "We need to keep this momentum going," Lisa said, not looking up from the screen. "The media's already picking this up, and more people are sharing their stories. It's time to take this to the streets." Miles stopped pacing. He knew she was right, but the idea of a protest felt daunting. What started as a moment of humiliation was now becoming a movement. It was bigger than just him. "I get it," he sighed, "but are we really ready for that? A protest? What if things go wrong?" Lisa glanced up, her green eyes sharp with determination. "Things are already wrong. This protest isn't just for you. It's for everyone who's ever been profiled. We need to show people we're not backing down." Miles leaned against his desk and rubbed his temples. The thought of stepping out from behind the safety of social media was terrifying, but this wasn't just about him anymore. "Okay," he finally said, "let's do it. But we need to make sure it's peaceful. I don't want this turning into a circus." Lisa grinned and stood up, grabbing her phone. "I'll start making calls. We'll need permits, speakers, the whole 9 yards. This is going to be big, Miles. Bigger than you think." As Lisa began organizing, Miles couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something far beyond his control. Marcus Dean's office at the airline headquarters was tense. The senior executives had summoned him to discuss the growing PR crisis, and the atmosphere in the boardroom was suffocating. Janet Marshall, the airline's CEO, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pulled tightly back, her expression cold and unreadable. "This is getting out of hand, Marcus," she said, her voice clipped. "You promised us this wouldn't escalate, yet here we are. A national movement, protests being planned. What's your plan to handle this?" Marcus clenched his jaw, his frustration barely concealed. "We're issuing statements, and I've been working with the PR team to downplay the incident. It's just a matter of time before the public moves on." Janet's gaze hardened. "Downplay it? You think a protest at the airport is something we can just downplay? This is a PR nightmare, and if it blows up, it's your head on the line." Marcus' grip tightened around his pen. "I'll take care of it," he said through gritted teeth. "I'll make sure Turner is neutralized before this gets worse." But even as he said the words, he felt the weight of his own vendetta creeping in. This wasn't just about the company's reputation anymore. It was personal. Miles sat in his living room, the glow of his phone illuminating the space. His mother's voice crackled through the speaker. "Miles, are you sure this is what you want?" she asked, her tone laced with concern. "This is getting dangerous. Protests, media attention. You have a family to think about." "I know, Mom," Miles replied, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "But this is bigger than me. It's bigger than all of us. You've worked so hard to get where you are," she continued, her voice softer now. "I just don't want to see you lose everything." Miles' stomach tightened. He understood her fear. He'd built his life from the ground up, and now it felt like he was on the brink of losing it all. "I won't lose everything," he said, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. "I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do. If I stay quiet, nothing will change." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We're proud of you, Miles," his mother finally said. "Just be careful." As he ended the call, Miles sat in the silence of his home, the enormity of his decision pressing down on him. This fight was going to cost him, but he didn't know how much yet. "Rachel, I don't know about this," Miles said, leaning back in the chair across from his sister in her cramped law office. Rachel, always calm and collected, adjusted her glasses and leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk between them. "This is our chance, Miles," Rachel said, her voice steady. "The airline violated your rights, and we need to hold them accountable. If we don't sue, what message does that send?" "I get it, but a lawsuit? That's big. What if we lose?" Rachel's eyes narrowed. "If we don't try, we've already lost. This isn't just about you. It's about setting a precedent for everyone else who's been through the same thing. You can't let fear stop you." Miles sighed, his gaze drifting out the window. The truth was, he was afraid. Afraid of the legal system, afraid of failure, afraid that this fight would consume him. "Okay," he said after a long pause. "Let's do it. But we need to be smart about this." Rachel smiled, the kind of smile that told him she'd been waiting for this moment. "Don't worry, little brother. I've got this." The crowd gathered outside O'Hare International Airport was larger than anyone expected. Hundreds of people stood in solidarity, holding signs that read #identity denied and "Stop Racial Profiling." Miles stood at the front of the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. Lisa stood next to him, megaphone in hand. "We're ready," she said, handing him the microphone. "Make your voice heard." Miles took a deep breath and stepped forward. The sea of faces stretched out before him, a mix of anger, hope, and determination. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves swirling inside him. "We're here today because what happened to me happens to too many people in this country. It's time for it to stop." The crowd cheered, their energy palpable. Miles continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "We're not here to cause chaos. We're here to demand justice. We're here to say that racial profiling has no place in our society, not in airports, not anywhere." As he spoke, he noticed a group of security officers approaching from the side. His pulse quickened. This could go wrong very quickly. Just as he finished his speech, a voice boomed over the crowd, "Disperse immediately, or you will be arrested." The tension in the air thickened. Miles glanced at Lisa, who shook her head. "We're not going anywhere," she whispered. Miles turned back to the crowd. "Stay peaceful," he called out. "We're here for justice, not violence." But the tension between the protesters and the security forces was growing. Miles could feel it. And as the officers pushed forward, things began to spiral out of control. The echo of sirens still rang in Miles' ears as he sat on the hard bench in the police station holding cell. The protest had gone sideways so fast. What started as a peaceful demonstration had spiraled into chaos the moment security pushed through the crowd. Miles hadn't expected things to escalate like this. He could still see the fear and anger in the faces of the protesters as the police arrived, barking orders. Lisa had tried to calm them down, but tensions were too high. Now, here he was, under arrest, his face plastered all over the news as the leader of what was quickly being branded as an unruly mob. The door to the holding area opened, and Rachel strode in, her expression a mixture of frustration and worry. "Miles," she said, sitting down on the bench beside him. "What the hell happened?" "I don't know," Miles sighed. "It got out of hand. I tried to keep things peaceful, but the cops didn't care. They wanted to shut us down from the start." Rachel ran a hand through her braids and took a deep breath. "This is bad. The media is all over it. They're already framing you as some kind of agitator. We need to get ahead of this, or the entire movement could collapse." Miles rubbed his hands together, his frustration bubbling over. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I wanted to shine a light on the injustice, not end up in a jail cell." "We'll fix this," Rachel assured him. "But first, we need to get you out of here. I'm working on bail now." As Rachel left, Miles stared down at his hands. The weight of the movement felt heavier than ever. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced. But right now, sitting in that cell, he felt more powerless than ever. Marcus Dean sat at his desk, scrolling through the flood of headlines on his tablet. The arrest of Miles Turner was dominating every news cycle, and for the first time in days, he felt a small sense of satisfaction. The narrative was shifting in his favor. He looked up as Janet Marshall, the CEO, entered his office, her face stern. "Well, Marcus," Janet said, closing the door behind her. "It seems you've managed to turn this around, at least for now." Marcus leaned back in his chair, feigning modesty. "Just doing my job. The protest got out of hand, and we took the appropriate measures. The media's eating it up." Janet sat down, crossing her arms. "Don't get too comfortable. This is far from over. Turner's a smart man, and he's got public sympathy on his side. The last thing we need is for this to backfire." "I've got it under control," Marcus replied smoothly. "We'll continue to emphasize the law and order angle. People don't like chaos. We'll make sure Turner is seen as the instigator, not the victim." Janet eyed him carefully. "Just remember, this isn't about personal vendettas. We need to protect the company. If you let your history with Turner cloud your judgment, we're going to have a problem." Marcus clenched his jaw but nodded. "Understood." As Janet left, Marcus turned his gaze back to the tablet, watching the footage of the protest unfold. This was his chance to bury Turner once and for all. He wasn't going to let a decades-old rivalry be the reason his career crumbled. Later that night, Rachel sat in her office, papers spread out across the desk. She had spent hours building the case, poring over civil rights statutes and legal precedents. The discrimination Miles faced wasn't just a personal slight. It was part of a larger, systemic issue, and she was determined to prove it. The door creaked open, and Miles stepped in, looking exhausted. "Bail wasn't easy, but I'm out." Rachel didn't look up, her fingers tapping across the keyboard. "We need to file the lawsuit as soon as possible. The longer we wait, the more they control the narrative." "Are you sure about this?" Miles asked, sitting down across from her. "They're already spinning the story. What if this just adds fuel to the fire?" Rachel stopped typing and met his eyes. "We can't be afraid of that. You were wronged, Miles, and this isn't just about you anymore. If we don't fight back legally, they'll crush this movement. You know that." Miles leaned back in his chair, the weight of it all pressing down on him. "I didn't expect it to go this far. I wanted change, but now?" "I know it's hard," Rachel said, her voice softening, "but you've started something important. You can't back down now." Miles nodded, though his mind raced with doubts. "I trust you. If you say we need to sue, then let's do it." Rachel gave him a determined look. "We're going to fight them with everything we have." Back at home, Miles slumped onto his couch, the dim light of his living room offering little comfort. His phone buzzed beside him, and he picked it up, seeing his mother's name on the screen. He hesitated, then answered. "Hey, Mom." "Miles, what's going on?" Her voice was laced with concern. "I saw the news. You were arrested?" "It's complicated," he muttered. "The protest got out of hand, and the police showed up." His mother's voice grew tense. "I'm worried about you. This isn't what you planned. What about your business? Your life? You're risking everything." "I know, Mom," he said, feeling a lump form in his throat, "but I can't just stop. This fight is important." "I understand that," she replied, "but I don't want to see you lose everything you've worked for." "I won't," he said, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. His mother sighed. "Just be careful, Miles. Please." As the call ended, Miles stared at the phone, the weight of his family's worry adding to his own. The strain was growing, and it wasn't just affecting him. It was affecting everyone around him. 2 days later, Miles sat in his office, scrolling through messages when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Is this Miles Turner?" a woman's voice asked. "Who's asking?" Miles replied cautiously. "I work for the airline," the woman said. "I've seen what's going on, and I need to talk to you. Privately." Miles' heart skipped a beat. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I have information," she said. Information that could help you. Internal documents, emails, proof that this isn't just about you. The airline's been targeting people of color for years, and it goes deeper than you think. Miles sat up straighter, his pulse racing. Why are you telling me this? Because it's wrong, she replied. And because I'm tired of being part of it. Meet me, Miles said quickly. We can talk in person. I'll be in touch, the woman said before hanging up. Miles sat there for a moment, staring at his phone. If this woman was telling the truth, it could change everything. He now had an unexpected ally, someone from the inside who could help him expose the airline's practices. The stakes had just been raised, and Miles knew that the next move could turn the tide in this fight. Miles paced in his office, his hands clenched tightly around his phone. The conversation with the whistleblower from the airline had left him restless. The internal documents she promised could change everything. He had been debating with Rachel for days on the best way to handle the information. It's too risky, Rachel said from across the room, her arms folded. If we go public with this now, they'll hit us with legal action before we can even get the lawsuit off the ground. I know, Miles replied, his voice taut, but we can't sit on this forever. People need to know the truth. Rachel sighed and walked over to him. The truth will come out, but if we leak it now, it might undermine everything we're trying to build. We have to be strategic. Before Miles could respond, Lisa burst through the door, her face flushed with excitement. I've got an idea, Lisa said, holding up her phone. We can release this in phases. We let a little bit of the information out first, just enough to spark curiosity. Once the media is hooked, we drop the rest. Miles raised an eyebrow. You want to play this like a marketing campaign? Exactly, Lisa nodded. The airline won't be able to react fast enough if we control the pace of the narrative. We've seen how quickly the hashtag identity denied movement spread. We use that momentum. Rachel considered it for a moment. It's risky, but it could work if we're careful. Miles glanced between the two women. The weight of the decision hung heavily in the air. Finally, he nodded. Let's do it. But we stick to the plan. We control the story. As Lisa rushed off to start the process, Miles and Rachel exchanged a look. The battle was about to get even more intense. Marcus Dean sat in a sterile conference room, surrounded by the airline's senior leadership team. His confidence had been waning ever since Miles' arrest had shifted public sympathy back in his favor, but he had kept up the facade of control. Now, with the leaked documents making headlines, the board was furious. Janet Marshall, the CEO, tapped her pen on the table, her silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Marcus, I thought you said you had this under control. I did, Marcus replied, his voice tight. No one could have predicted Turner would have a source inside the company. We're dealing with an internal leak. I don't care about the how, Janet snapped. What I care about is the fact that we're being dragged through the mud in every major news outlet. Racial profiling, discriminatory policies. This is a PR nightmare. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'll handle it. We just need to downplay the importance of the documents. Claim they were taken out of context. Out of context? Janet cut him off. We've seen the emails. This is a systemic issue, and now it's out in the open. If you don't get ahead of this, your head will be the first to roll. The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus swallowed hard. I'll fix this. I'll deal with Turner. As the meeting ended, Marcus stormed out of the room, anger boiling beneath the surface. He had underestimated Miles once again, and now his career was on the line. He wouldn't make that mistake a third time. The leak had sparked a firestorm of public outrage. Across social media, the hashtag #IdentityDenied was trending worldwide again, and stories of racial discrimination in air travel flooded the internet. Miles watched the numbers climb on his phone screen, the support pouring in from all corners of the country. We did it, Lisa said, sitting across from him in their office. People are listening. It's bigger than us now. Miles nodded, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished. This was never just about me. It's about everyone who's been through this. Lisa smiled, but then her face grew serious. But we can't get comfortable. The airline will come at us hard. Marcus isn't going to let this go. We're ready, Miles replied, his voice steady. And now, we've got more than just a story. We've got the truth. Just then, Rachel walked in, carrying a stack of papers. "I've filed the lawsuit," she said, dropping the documents on the table. "We're officially in legal territory now. The court battle's coming, and we need to be prepared for a long fight." Miles stared at the legal papers, the reality of the situation sinking in. "We're ready." Rachel gave him a reassuring nod. "We've got a strong case, and with the public on our side, they'll have a hard time shutting us down." As they sat together, the weight of the movement pressed down on them, but so did a sense of hope. They were turning the tide, and for the first time in weeks, Miles felt like they could actually win. The strain of the battle had taken its toll on Miles' personal life. He hadn't seen his family in days, too consumed with the movement, the protests, the media frenzy. But as he sat alone in his office one evening, his phone buzzed, and he saw his mother's name flash on the screen. "Miles," she said softly when he answered. "It's been too long. How are you holding up?" Miles leaned back in his chair, the tension in his shoulders easing at the sound of her voice. "It's been a lot. I didn't expect things to get this big." "We're proud of you," she continued, "but I'm worried. You've put everything on the line." "I had to," Miles replied. "I couldn't stand by and let this happen to me, or anyone else." "I know," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "But don't forget about us. We're here for you, no matter what." A lump formed in Miles' throat as he realized how distant he had become from his family in the midst of the fight. "I haven't forgotten. There's so much at stake." His mother paused for a moment before speaking again. "Just promise me you won't lose yourself in all this." Miles closed his eyes. "I promise." After the call ended, Miles sat in silence for a while, reflecting on how far he had come and the sacrifices he had made. The road ahead was long, but he knew he wasn't walking it alone. The courtroom was packed, reporters lining the back walls, cameras flashing as Miles and Rachel walked in. The lawsuit had captured the attention of the nation, and today was the first day of what was sure to be a lengthy legal battle. Rachel, calm and composed, took her seat beside Miles at the plaintiff's table. Across the room, Marcus sat with the airline's legal team, his expression hard and unreadable. "This is it," Rachel whispered to Miles. "Everything we've worked for comes down to this." Miles nodded, his heart pounding. He had faced a lot of challenges in his life, but this felt different. This wasn't just a fight for personal justice, it was a fight for systemic change. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. The airline's lawyers opened with a predictable defense, claiming the leaked documents were misleading, that the company had policies in place to ensure fairness. But when Rachel stood to deliver her opening argument, her voice was clear, firm, and unwavering. "This case isn't about isolated incidents," she began. "It's about a pattern of discrimination that has been allowed to fester within this company for years. My client, Miles Turner, is not just a victim of racial profiling. He is a representative of countless individuals who have been treated unfairly simply because of the color of their skin." As she spoke, Miles felt a surge of pride for his sister and for the movement they had built together. This wasn't just about winning a lawsuit, it was about setting a precedent for the future. The first day of the trial ended with a flurry of media attention, but as Miles walked out of the courthouse, he felt a sense of resolve. They had turned the tide. Now, it was time to finish what they had started. The courtroom was silent as the judge entered, the tension in the air thick enough to cut through. Miles sat next to Rachel, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Across the aisle, Marcus Dean sat with the airline's legal team, his face a mask of composure, though Miles could see the tension in his jaw. Rachel leaned in and whispered, "Stay calm. We've got this." Miles nodded, trying to keep his nerves at bay. He had never been more prepared, but the stakes were so high. This wasn't just about winning. It was about justice for every person who had been wronged by a system that saw them as less than. The trial began with opening statements from both sides. The airline's attorney stood, his voice smooth and calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a misunderstanding, not malicious intent. The documents in question have been taken out of context, and my client has always acted in good faith." Miles tuned out the familiar spin, his eyes drifting to Marcus. He couldn't help but feel the old resentment bubbling to the surface, the same rivalry that had started in high school and now played out on a national stage. But this time, it was bigger than the two of them. When it was Rachel's turn, she stood tall and spoke with conviction. This case isn't about a misunderstanding. It's about a systemic issue that has plagued the airline industry for years. My client, Miles Turner, was a victim of racial profiling, and we have the evidence to prove that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a much larger problem. She presented the leaked documents from the whistleblower, showing a clear pattern of discrimination. As the jury listened, Miles could see the shift in their expressions. They were starting to understand the gravity of what was at stake. The trial dragged on for days, with witnesses called and cross-examinations conducted. But the turning point came when Marcus was called to the stand. He walked up slowly, his usual confidence faltering just a little as he took the oath. Rachel approached him with measured steps, her voice steady. "Mr. Dean, you've known my client for a long time, haven't you?" Marcus hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "Yes, we went to high school together. And would you say you have a personal grudge against him?" Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No, this isn't personal." Rachel held up one of the leaked emails. "Then can you explain this email you sent, referring to Mr. Turner as a troublemaker who needed to be dealt with? It seems to me that this goes beyond professional. It seems personal." The courtroom was dead silent as Marcus struggled to maintain his composure. His carefully constructed facade was cracking. "That email was taken out of context," Marcus replied, but his voice wavered. Rachel didn't relent. "Out of context or not, it shows your clear bias against my client. And this isn't just one email. There are dozens of documents here showing that under your leadership, racial profiling wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged." Marcus clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "I did what I had to do. He made this personal." Rachel's eyes flashed with victory as she turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, there it is. This wasn't about company policy. This was about a personal vendetta." Marcus Dean's animosity toward Miles Turner influenced how this case was handled, and it's time for accountability. As Marcus slumped in his chair, defeated, the jury exchanged glances. The momentum had shifted. The final day of the trial arrived, and the air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation. Miles sat beside Rachel, his heart pounding as the judge entered and took his seat. The jury had reached a verdict. The foreman stood, clearing his throat. "In the case of Miles Turner versus the airline, we find in favor of the plaintiff." The words echoed in Miles' ears as a wave of emotion crashed over him. He had won. They had won. The judge continued, issuing an order for damages and requiring the airline to issue a public apology for its discriminatory practices. But the real victory wasn't in the money or the apology. It was in the precedent they had set. As the courtroom erupted in murmurs and applause, Miles turned to Rachel, a smile breaking through the tension. "We did it," he whispered. Rachel grinned, squeezing his hand. "This is just the beginning." Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs and chanting. When Miles and Rachel stepped out, they were greeted by cheers and applause. The movement had grown far beyond what any of them had imagined. Lisa rushed over, her face glowing with excitement. "You did it, Miles. We all did it." Miles looked out at the crowd, feeling a swell of pride and gratitude. "This isn't just my victory," he said, his voice loud enough for the crowd to hear. "This is our victory. For every person who has been silenced, every person who has been treated unfairly, we're just getting started." The crowd roared in response, the energy electric. The hashtag Identity Denied movement had sparked a nationwide conversation about racial injustice, and now, it had the legal precedent to back it up. Later that evening, Miles found himself alone in his office, the cheers of the crowd still ringing in his ears. The sun had set, casting the room in shadows, but Miles didn't mind the darkness. It gave him space to reflect. He thought about how far he had come. From a businessman just trying to make his way in the world to a national symbol for justice. The journey had been long, and at times, it had nearly broken him. But now, sitting here in the quiet, he realized that every struggle had been worth it. There was a knock on the door, and Rachel stepped in, her face soft with pride. "You okay?" she asked, sitting down across from him. Miles nodded slowly. Yeah, I didn't expect it to feel like this. Rachel smiled. Like what? Like it's not really over, he said. We won the trial, but there's still so much work to do. Rachel leaned forward, her voice gentle. The fight for justice never really ends, Miles. But today, we took a huge step forward, and we'll keep fighting, one step at a time. Miles looked at his sister, gratitude filling his chest. I couldn't have done this without you. Rachel's eyes softened. We did it together, and we'll keep doing it together. A few weeks later, Miles stood backstage at a national conference on racial equality. The movement had grown even larger, with people from all over the country uniting under the banner of #IdentityDenied. Today, he would speak to a crowd of thousands, sharing his story and calling for continued action. As he adjusted his suit, Lisa appeared by his side, her usual bright smile in place. You ready for this? Miles chuckled. I don't think I'll ever be ready for something like this. You're a natural, Lisa said, giving him a playful nudge. Besides, this is what you were meant for. Miles took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling in. He had always been a businessman, focused on building his company and his future. But now, he realized that his true calling was something bigger. Thank you, Lisa, he said quietly. For everything. Lisa grinned. Always, Miles. The announcer's voice boomed over the speakers, introducing him to the stage. As Miles stepped out into the spotlight, the crowd erupted in applause. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The lights, the energy, the faces of the people who had come together for something bigger than themselves. Miles took the microphone and smiled. This is just the beginning.